Curtis by Curtis Mayfield. This album is actually the songbook, so I actually used to have this, had this for years. I mean, you can tell this is probably from the 70s, and how to try and understand his arrangements. So Curtis was Curtis Mayfield's debut album. Now, Curtis Mayfield was in a group called The Impressions. So this is number 8 on the list of my favourite albums. Before then, I've explained other albums before, so if you want to listen to them videos, you can look at them up. So this debut album by Curtis Mayfield, released in 1970, September, was produced by Mayfield, and it was released on his own record label. The musical styles of Curtis moved further away from the pop soul sounds of Mayfield's previous group, The Impressions, and featured more of a funk and psychedelic influenced sound. And the subject matter was a lot more political and social concerns of the time. So Curtis did very well at the time. Actually was very well in the black music chart, did very well in the UK as well, and singles like Move On Up, which is probably the most famous song off that album, did very well. So when we're looking at this album, Mayfield actually came up with this album because he actually never wanted to leave The Impressions originally. He would officially leave them a year later, but it was the idea of he wanted to do solo work. And so most of Curtis Mayfield's lyrics in this album reflects on the social issues, mainly under Nixon at the time. So the presidency under Nixon. Also 1970 was a very influential time because we had the idea of just had left the civil rights movement, then you obviously got the Black Panthers and the rest of that sort of movement in the black community. So this kind of idea of racism he talks about and the other ideas of this. When you're looking at obviously the idea of all of these songs are written by Curtis Mayfield, and they have some very poignant ideas within them. So when we're looking at some of these songs, I didn't mention them with some of the others, but Don't Worry If There's Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go is a song which is like an epic masterpiece, and the actual orchestration was done by a guy called Johnny Pate. Johnny Pate had done the soundtrack to Shaft, the third Shaft film. He's also got an album called Outrageous, which has some great orchestral ideas. Prodigy sampled a lot from it, actually, that album. But when we're looking at the whole theme of this Curtis Mayfield album, it is again a concept album because there's always these little themes going on within it. So Don't Worry If There's Hell Below Has All Got to Go. He's talking about the ideas of different races trying to survive in life and how that works. And then he's also trying to explain how the system can keep people down and how everybody's trying to live a certain life, but the governments are actually making it harder. So he's claiming hell is within Earth. There's a lot of spiritual concepts of this. He's got The Other Side of Town, which again he's talking about the idea of how people are segregated. Then he goes into The Makings of You, which is a 3/4 waltz, and this is kind of this was a song about his wife, about the love of his wife and who had his children, and it's obviously based on that idea of old music, waltz, love songs, ballads. One of the things with Curtis Mayfield is also because he's quite tender in his voice, because he uses his falsetto a lot. So it gives you this kind of tenderness, which is a bit different to the aggression of, say, maybe Sly Stone, or maybe even like some other artists who soul music had that kind of rough timbre. I think Curtis kind of went more for the softer feel. Then he goes into other type ideas. We people are darker than blue. So he goes again about segregation, about the idea of how he wants to see the world in a better place. Move On Up, again, he's on about social class, plus also about the idea of everybody becoming one. So a lot of his ideas are from the teachings of Martin Luther King, and that also influenced his music and his political attributes and aspirations he wanted to do. Never actually got into politics himself, but he was very politically based and social politically. Miss Black America is about his daughter wanting to be a beauty queen pageant, and the idea of that she could become that. And then Wild and Free and Give It Up are about these ideas of people having freedom and feeling non-restrained in that society. So why do I love this album? Well, a couple of things. Great songs, really very, very memorable lyrics. It's very different in soul music because if you listen to Marvin Gaye, you maybe get anger and you get all these different emotions. But with Curtis Mayfield, it always feel like you can listen to it and it puts you in a good mood. It's very gentle, it's very uplifting. But the musical arrangements are very depthy. So you actually can learn a lot from every time you listen to this album. You can hear different ideas, and it's also, I think, because he's trying to come up with this unionship and this utopian ideal, I think the idea of all the sounds is based on that. Now, whether that's how he came up with it, or maybe because it was in the 70s, the idea coming out of the 60s, which could have been seen as idealistic, but it wasn't. There were still problems. But the 70s was about a new decade, a new era. And so 1970 has actually got some very important albums in the soul movement. We've got Curtis by Curtis Mayfield, we've got What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, which is a social conscious record, and then we've got There's a Riot Going On by Sly Stone, which is the next album I'm going to describe. So when we're looking at Curtis, we have to look at the idea of why these songs are great, and the main thing is when you're learning songwriting is understanding tempo, feel, and also how you create a message within music. And I think that is where Curtis Mayfield does this very well. So that's why I love this album, and please, if you get a chance or if you want to ask any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.